Elevate Overlay uses Greenstyle's new size chart, which includes bust sizes from 30 inches to 61 inches and hip sizes from 32 inches to 62 inches. Use your size based on your full bust measurement. Then measure your hip. If it is more than one size off from your full bust measurement, you'll want to blend sizes to get the best fit, but you shouldn't need your waist measurement as there's plenty of ease in the waist. Once you've selected your size, you'll need to cut the following pieces. One front piece cut on the fold. Here you see the longer length designed for the regular hem or tie-back option. If you want to make the banded hem option, you'll want to cut the shorter length. Cut two back pieces as mirror images. And be sure to mark the line notated as overlap here on the pattern piece. You'll need this for the banded and regular hemmed version. Be sure to mark it on both pieces. You'll need one of the overlay front neck binding pieces cut on the fold, and you'll also need two of the overlay back binding pieces. When cutting these pieces, pay attention to the cut line for hem or banded length versus the tie-back length, which is longer. If you're making the sleeveless version, you'll need two of the overlay arm side binding pieces. If you're making the sleeved version, you'll need two sleeves cut on the fold. Just keep in mind you'll only need the sleeves or the binding, not both. And finally, the back upper strap piece, which is optional. Begin construction by pinning the shoulder seams. Lay your front piece face up on your work table, and then bring your back pieces over and lay them face down on top of that front piece. Check that you've aligned them correctly so that the straight side seams align and the diagonal line of the back piece goes across the front piece. Head on over to your sewing machine or serger and stitch up these two short shoulder seams using a serger or stretch stitch. We'll begin the binding process by attaching the front binding piece to both of the back pieces. Lay the three pieces face up on your table, and then we are going to pin them with right sides together. So this back piece, I'm going to turn it over and lay it right sides together with the end of the front piece. And what this does, it's going to create one very long binding piece. So we'll just pin them here, and then take them over to the serger or sewing machine and use a stretch stitch right there to stitch them together. Now they're stitched together, and you can see the two seams creating one very long piece. There are the two seams. There's the front and the two back pieces. Now bring over your front and back pieces which are attached at the shoulder seams and lay them out on your table. This can be a little bit of a process because it's a very large piece right now. There's the front, and those are the two backs. Those are the slanted edges that are going to cross over your back. Find the center of your front binding piece by folding it in half, matching up those seams of your binding piece. And then find the front center of your shirt by matching up the shoulder seams and finding the front center that way. This is where we'll begin attaching the binding to the shirt. We're going to attach right sides together and align the raw edges. So we'll match up those two centers that we just found, and then the seam of the shirt and the seam of the binding will be matched as well. So I'm pinning those right now. So now I have the front of the shirt pinned. Now to pin the back, you are going to start at the very bottom and you're going to lay the binding flat against the bottom. Then right where it starts to curve in the back, you're going to have a little bit of tension. So we'll again lay it flat along the bottom, and then right where it starts to curve, we'll stop pinning. And then we'll just pull very gently and pin the rest, because you're going to need to have a little bit of stretch on the binding around the curve of the back. Now we'll stitch this up using our serger or stretch stitch and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Remembering that you're stitching 1:1 ratio at the bottom, but once it gets to the curve, you're going to need to stretch that binding piece ever so slightly. Be very careful that you don't stretch it too much, only enough so that it doesn't pucker or bubble underneath your binding piece. And now the first step of binding is done. They're attached with right sides facing all the way down. Make sure it looks nice and smooth all the way. Now we're at the ironing board, and we're going to go ahead and iron that binding seam toward the binding. I like to iron from the outside first, so I'll use my fingers to feel and make sure that that seam is always going toward the binding. And now flip it over and turn the edge of that binding under 1/4 inch. I'm not measuring, I'm just estimating here. And this will give you a nice finished edge on the inside of your shirt where the binding is. This is actually optional since your shirt won't fray. It definitely won't show from the outside if you're doing the hemmed or the banded version. It might show a little bit if you're doing the tied back version down at the bottom of the ties where they flip over from tying them. But it is optional, so you can decide how much care you want to take in this binding. I always prefer to do an extra step of ironing and get that really pretty finished edge on the inside. Now we'll take the edge of the binding and fold it over so that it just covers up that seam. Pin or clip it in place, and feel free to use lots and lots of pins and clips. If you choose to leave the edge of that binding raw, you won't have quite as nice of a finished edge on the inside there. It'll be a raw edge and it'll overhang the seam by about 1/4 inch. And after you stitch everything in place, you can choose to trim off that excess or just leave it there on the inside. can use your cover stitch or sewing machine with a twin needle or even a zigzag stitch to close up this binding. So let's take a close look at this binding piece. We've got a closed seam on the outside. It's nice and closed there, and we're going to be stitching on top of the binding very close to that seam. If we look on the inside, we'll see that it's a folded piece of binding and it's open. That's what we're going to be closing up with our top stitching. Because this is an open end of a cover stitch as opposed to a complete circle like a hem or a neckband, I'll start off with a scrap piece of fabric by about 1 inch and then just continue on to my actual garment. So we're stitching right close to that seam of the binding, and we're going to go all the way across this long binding piece. And here's what it will look like from the outside with your stitching close to the seam there. Try and catch the light just right so you can see. And on the inside, you'll see the stitching holding that fold closed. And it's nice and finished on the inside if you did that additional fold. And then we can cut off our scrap piece of fabric, but I like to leave a little bit of fabric there because that helps keep that stitch locked in so that the cover stitch doesn't fall out before hemming. If you're making the sleeves, follow here. If you're making the sleeveless version, you can skip ahead to step 8 and see how we finish that arm side. Here we have the shirt laying right side up on the table, and you see the shoulder seam at the center there. Bring over your sleeve piece and mark the center of the sleeve cap by folding the sleeve piece in half and just clipping at that fold. Lay your sleeve right side up on the table, and then you'll flip it up onto your shirt. Match the center of the sleeve with the shoulder seam, and then match the edge of the sleeve with the edge of the shirt on either side, and then go through and pin all the way down. It's much easier to pin a curved edge if you lift it up and you match up the two pieces at the seam line, which is 3/8 inch in from the edge. Bring your shirt over to the serger or sewing machine and attach that sleeve along that pinned edge using your serger stitch or stretch stitch or zigzag and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Notice that the fingers of my left hand are doing a lot of work as I stitch. They're feeling to make sure everything is smooth underneath and that I don't have any folds or puckers or extra pieces of the shirt trying to go underneath the needle. And here's what the sleeve looks like when it's first attached. Now to pin the side seams, we fold the sleeve in half and line up the side seam on the front and back pieces. Then we'll pin all the way from the end of the sleeve through the underarm of the arm side and down the side seam to the hem. Stitch using your serger or sewing machine and the stretch stitch or zigzag in a 3/8 inch seam allowance. If you're making the sleeveless option, you need to stitch up that side seam before you add the arm side binding. You'll attach the arm side binding using basically the same technique that you used for the binding on the front and back edge of the shirt. Take the arm side binding piece and match up the two short ends and stitch them closed with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. You'll end up with a small loop. Fold the loop in half with the seam being one end of the fold and the other end of the fold mark with a pin. So now that you've marked the loop into two equal pieces, the pin will go up at the shoulder seam. Match raw edges together and right sides together as well. The seam of the loop will go down at the underarm seam and pin that as well with right sides together, matching up the raw edges. And now you'll stretch the binding piece just enough so that it matches the edges of the arm side. Pin it all the way around. Stitch the binding onto the arm side using a serger or stretch stitch and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now bring your shirt over to the work table and lay it with wrong sides up. We'll pin the binding without doing any ironing since it's such a small piece. I'm folding over 1/4 inch and then folding it over the seam and pinning directly. It's such a small piece, ironing in that small circle would be more difficult than it was worth. But just want to make sure that you press it with your fingers to make sure that the seam is facing up toward the binding and being enclosed within the folded binding piece. Now we're going to finish it right along that edge there using our cover stitch or sewing machine. So using your cover stitch or on the sewing machine, a twin needle or zigzag, you'll stitch right on top of the binding, very close to the seam where the binding is attached to the front of the shirt. And we are stitching from the right side of the shirt, again on top of the binding. You may notice that my machine says stitch number 1, which is a straight stitch. Please ignore that. I actually made a shirt with sleeves, but just wanted to show the steps of the binding. So I'm using a basting stitch so that I can easily remove the binding and add the sleeve, but don't use a basting stitch here. Now here's a step where you will use a basting stitch. If you are doing the hemmed bottom or the hem band bottom, you'll need to baste the two back pieces together. Lay your shirt with the back facing upward, right side out. Now you're going to use those two markings that we talked about in the cutting section. I've put 2 clips on those marking spots. And what you're going to do is fold the two back pieces over on top of each other, and the ends of the back pieces are going to go all the way to those markings and you can go ahead and pin the 2 layers of the back together at those spots. And then in between them, you can pin the rest of the way as well. Now you can see that you've pinned the 2 back layers and the front layer is separate. You're going to baste those 2 layers together all the way from pin to pin. If you're using the banded hem option or the tie back option, go ahead and follow the instructions in the tutorial. This is the hemmed bottom option that I will show you. So the back pieces are now basted together. And what we're going to do is turn our shirt inside out in order to mark for hemming. My hemming tools of choice are an acrylic ruler and a wash away marker. What I like to do when hemming the bottom of a shirt or the bottom of a skirt, for example, is mark the inside of the shirt double the amount of the hem. So for instance, on this pattern tutorial, it says to turn the shirt up 1/2 inch. So therefore I would mark 1 inch up from the bottom of my shirt. That way when I fold it up, I'm folding up 1/2 inch to get to that 1 inch marker. You'll notice that I'm actually marking my shirt 2 inches on here. That's because I want a full 1 inch hem. I'm short, I'm only 5'3", and I just wanted to hem it to make it a little bit shorter than the pattern called for. Once I've got it all marked, I like to use spray starch in order to really set that fold at the bottom so that when I take it over to my machine to hem it, it'll be a lot easier to maintain that fold. I'll also fold up the edges of the sleeves in order to hem those as well. And I won't be measuring or marking on those because it's such a small little space. I'll eyeball it and then check it with my ruler afterwards. There's also an optional cuff that you can add to the end of your sleeve, and if you'd like to do that, just go ahead and follow the instructions in the tutorial for adding that cuff. If I used an iron and spray starch on the bottom of a hemmed shirt, I would sometimes hem it without adding pins, but because of the back of the shirt has 2 layers folded plus the binding, that's many layers of fabric in some places, I recommend adding some pins just to make sure that everything stays in place when you go ahead and stitch it. Again, I'm using my cover stitch to hem, but you can do this on your sewing machine with a twin needle or a zigzag stitch. I love this gorgeous hem on this beautiful lush rib knit from Millie Mae. If your hem looks a little different from mine, don't fret. Remember that I did mine 1 inch as opposed to the 1/2 inch mentioned in the pattern tutorial. Now we'll hem both sleeves using the same method that we used for the bottom of the shirt. Now we'll make that cute little strap that goes across the back. This is great if your overlay tends to fall off your shoulders, and if you want, you can leave it off when you do your initial construction and add it later if you find that you need it. If you want your overlay to be reversible, you won't want this strap because then it would go across your collarbones when you turned it around for the front. Begin by folding your strap piece in half along the long edge with right sides together, and we're going to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all along that long edge. Use your serger or stretch stitch on your sewing machine like I'm doing. My stretch stitch is number 6, the lightning bolt stitch. And here we have our strap. It's currently inside out, and you can see the stitch line going all the way down. So what you need to do is, after you trim off those threads, grab a safety pin and use that as your turning tool to turn the strap right side out. Now we can attach the strap to the back of our shirt. Begin by marking 3 inches down from the shoulder seams. You can see I have 2 pins in that location. Pin the end of the strap to the inside of the binding so that it goes just past the binding. And make sure you pin it so that the right side of the strap is facing outward and the seam is facing inward toward your body. Now take it over to your sewing machine and you are going to stitch from the front of the shirt through the binding and through the strap, and you'll want to follow the stitch line of your top stitching on your binding. So you're just going to use a straight stitch and just go just as far as the strap. Go straight over the strap and stitch just on top of your other stitch line. You can go back and forth a few times and it'll be apparent on the outside of your shirt, but it should look consistent with the stitching that was already there. And you're done. Go forth and enjoy your beautiful new Greenstyle Elevate overlay. I know that I'm going to love wearing mine in this lush rib knit from Millie Mae all the time.